Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. And please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar, again, is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Candy Riker, is watching that feature and will present and prepare a list of questions for the presenter at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions before we run out of time today. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today. Dr. David Brodnax is Professor of History and History Department Chair at Trinity Christian College in Palos Heights. His research focuses on African American social and legal history in the 19th and early 20th century Midwest, particularly the state of Iowa. His recent scholarly activity includes the chapter Black Self-Defense in 19th Century Iowa for the Oxford Handbook for Midwestern History, the article The Present and Future of Black Midwestern Historical Scholarship for Middle West Review, and serving on the advisory boards for the Amplifying Black Voices in Iowa Grant Project and the Racism and Resistance in Iowa Book Project. At Trinity, he teaches a variety of courses on American, African, and Latin American history. He also teaches a course each year at the University of Iowa College of Law, where he holds adjunct faculty status. In 2021, he was named Trinity's Professor of the Year. He earned his JD from Iowa College of Law and his MA and PhD from Northwestern University. Dr. Brodnax lives in the Chicago suburbs of Berwyn. In his free time, he enjoys volunteering at his two churches, traveling with his girlfriend, cycling, photography, and supporting his beloved Chicago Cubs, Chicago Sky, Arsenal Football Club, and of course, the Iowa Hawkeyes. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Brodnax to begin the webinar.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. Just want to check and make sure that you can hear me. Am I coming through all right?
Yes, we can hear you on our end.
All right, excellent. So can't tell who all is out there watching or taking part, but whoever you are and wherever you are, thank you for joining us this afternoon, for taking a little bit of your time to learn a little bit more about the history of Hawkeye State. I hope I prepared something useful, informative, something thought-provoking that will help you learn a little bit more about this part of Iowa's history. And also for anybody who may watch this after the fact as a recording or read the transcript, whenever and wherever you happen to take part in this, thank you for doing so. I want to start, so you all see the title screen here for the State Historical Society. Um, and then I'll next go to my specific title screen. So our topic for today is Iowa's African American Civil War heritage. Now, I want to start by giving everyone a few questions to think about. Not necessarily that you have to come up with answers for this right now or for you to give answers to this at the end, but just kind of some framing questions to give you something for a lens through which to think about what we're going to be talking about over the next hour. So these questions are, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to serve your country? Now, I don't mean serve in like ironic quotes, but to, just trying to highlight the word serve in that sentence. What is the meaning of the phrase, your country? What does citizenship mean? Right? These are all words that people use quite often today, and certainly they use them in 19th century Iowa. But what do these words actually mean? And then finally, how do we use voices from the past, like some of the sources that I used for this presentation today, to understand our history, right? So just sort of keep those in mind, keep these questions in mind as we go through Iowa's Black history during the Civil War and in the years after the Civil War, right? So I actually want to start today, after we have with these introductory questions, with the brief story of the person you could say is the first Black Iowa. And that is a man remembered as York. So Iowa's Black history starts back in the year 1803. York encamped near what's now the city of Sioux City. He was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he took an equal share of the labors and the dangers of traveling all the way from southern Illinois outside St. Louis to Oregon, way up in the Northwest, and back again. But York was also the only involuntary member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was enslaved by William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He's the only Black member. He's the only enslaved member. And his story symbolizes the challenges that Iowa's Black residents faced in the decades to come. Now, a lot of people don't immediately think of the state of Iowa when they think of African American history or the Civil War. And there's some validity to this. Iowa's Black population is comparatively small and always has been. On the other hand, the small size of Iowa's Black population then and now, but especially then, makes it even more remarkable what African Americans were able to accomplish during and after the Civil War. And just to give you a preview of what we're going to be talking about, coming to Iowa at all in the midst of war and persecution, forming a Black regiment, and then a Black veterans organization that petitioned the state government for social change after the war, helping Iowa become the first northern state after the war to give Black men the right to vote, helping Iowa also become the first northern state after the war to desegregate its public schools, holding Emancipation Day celebrations that remembered slavery, emancipation, war, and freedom in the past and call for equal rights in the present, and running a successful newspaper. And all of this, all these big stories are to say nothing of the many Black veterans and their families who lived throughout the state and worked, raised families, gained an education, sent their children to schools, volunteered in churches and other community organizations, petitioned for their veterans' pensions, and otherwise took place in thousands of everyday activities that helped to shape Iowa history. So this webinar is going to tell the stories of those Black Iowans from the 1860s till the early 1900s. Let's shift a little bit to talking about racial dynamics in Iowa before the war, because in order to understand what Black Iowans were seeking to change, you have to know what was set up in the first place that they thought needed to be changed. Iowa's very first territorial legislature met in 1838. And at this very first meeting of the Iowa legislature, they followed other Midwestern states in passing a law that became known as the Act to Regulate Blacks and Mulattoes. These laws banned Black people from voting, from serving in the Iowa legislature, from serving on juries, from intermarrying with whites, from attending public schools. So to be clear, it wasn't that the schools were segregated, there were Black schools and white schools. The schools were only for white children. Black children were completely banned from the public schools. And the law also banned African Americans from settling in Iowa at all unless they had written proof of their freedom and could post a $500 bond to guarantee their quote unquote good behavior. In spite of these laws, hundreds of African Americans came to Iowa in the 3 decades before the Civil War. And by 1860, the federal census recorded just over 1,000 African Americans living in the state. And as you can see here, I've for each county that had at least one Black resident, I've put the number that were living in that county. So you can see that this population of about 1,000 in 1860, very heavily concentrated in the Mississippi River towns and also in the sort of the southeastern quadrant of the state. Some of these Black settlers, like Alexander Clark, had been born free in other parts of the North or in the South. Others had come to Iowa after gaining their freedom. Some had been brought to Iowa as enslaved people. For instance, Alexander Clark's wife, Catherine Griffin Clark. Many of them had fled from slavery. especially in the neighboring state of Missouri and the nearby state of Kentucky. Now, you may be thinking, I thought there was an anti-migration law. Did all of these folks post the bond and provide proof of their freedom? How could a fugitive slave provide proof of their freedom? The answer to that is this anti-migration law was actually very rarely enforced because these black settlers did the dangerous and the physically exhausting and the low paying work that white Iowans did not want to do. So law enforcement simply looked the other way when it came to enforcing the migration law. On the other hand, the other racist laws most certainly were enforced. Black children had no access to education except in two places, in Muscatine and in Fayette County, where the black population, the black community established private schools. And also in southeastern Iowa, there were some black children who received private tutoring from white Quakers. Aside from that, black children received no formal education. The same was also true of voting rights. The ballot box was completely closed to black Iowans. In 1857, lawmakers met to write a new state constitution, and they spent a great deal of time debating the question of racial equality, especially desegregating the public school system and black voting rights, specifically black male voting rights. In the end, the delegates decided to, in their new constitution, that they would create segregated schools for black children, and they would allow the voters to decide in a statewide referendum if black men should in fact get the right to vote. Well, that failed miserably. 83% of white Iowa voters rejected the idea that black men should get the right to vote in 1857. 3 years later, of course, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and most of the slave states seceded from the Union and demanded ownership of southern military bases. And when Lincoln refused to concede to that, the Civil War began in early 1861. Now, it's worth noting that the first state to secede, South Carolina, their declaration of secession, basically, this was a list of reasons why they thought they could no longer be in the United States, included a complaint about Iowa, where they said, quote, the states of Iowa, Ohio, and Iowa have refused to surrender to justice fugitives charged with murder and with inciting servile insurrection in the state of Virginia. Thus, the constituted compact has been deliberately broken and disregarded by the non-slaveholding states, and the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from her obligation. What are secessionists in South Carolina talking about? They're talking about the fact that two of the abolitionists who took part in John Brown's failed attempt to overthrow slavery in 1859 were in fact Iowans. Actually, there were more than just the two, but the two who survived had gone back to Iowa, and Iowa's governor had refused to hand them over to the authorities of Virginia. So this Iowa, in an indirect way, helps bring about secession and the Civil War. Now, from the very beginning of the war, Lincoln insisted that this war was not a war against slavery. And both sides insisted that this was a white man's fight, and blacks would not be allowed to enlist. But African Americans in Iowa and elsewhere had their own vision of what the war was about and what America could be after the war. So as soon as the Union Army began traveling through the South, African Americans started running away from slavery and following the Union Army around. And the Union troops were supposed to return these fugitives to their slave owners, but instead, many of them were given jobs with the military as cooks or as laborers. And some of these soldiers who were from the North encouraged these fugitive slaves to move up north. So some Iowa troops in the South said to some of the fugitive slaves who they met, we need help on the farm back home. Why don't you go up and my wife is there, my family's there, and you can work for my family. There were also thousands more fugitive slaves who left the South entirely on their own. So now I'll give you a quote from General Howard, who said in 1861, quote, it's probable that the freedmen have left Missouri in large numbers for Kansas, Iowa, etc. This turned out to be a massive understatement. Iowa's black population almost quintupled in the 5 years between 1860 in 1865. When you compare the 1860 federal census and 1865 state census, the Black population is nearly quintupled, and those are only the people who are actually listed on the census. So when we look at this massive wartime migration, we can see a couple of patterns, several patterns. The first of these is that as soon as the war started, thousands of enslaved people headed to the north, as I mentioned. The second pattern is that when it comes to Iowa, most of these wartime migrants went to southeast Iowa, to the Mississippi River towns, or the Nottoway Valley in southwest Iowa. The third pattern has to do with how these different groups got to where they went. The ones who went to the Mississippi River towns mainly traveled up the river, usually after having first gone to St. Louis or Memphis or other Mississippi River towns that were further south. On the other hand, most of those who went to central or southwest Iowa were Missourians, and they entered Iowa, frankly, by walking across the state line. And this travel was often done in conjunction with the military. The fourth pattern that we can see is that the mid-sized towns in eastern and south central Iowa also gained dozens of migrants. Not as many as in the southeast or in the Mississippi River or the Nottoway Valley, but still quite a few. And then also there were a number of much more rural areas around the state that maybe got one person, got one family. So you see communities that previously were all white, and now there's one Black resident, now there's one Black family, right? So that's kind of, excuse me, the overall trend that we can see. So let's take a look at some of these specific places. By the time you get to the end of the war, Mount Pleasant and Keokuk were both more than 10% Black, which was unprecedented in Iowa history. A lot of Black migrants went to Mount Pleasant because the town had a reputation for racial liberalism. Keokuk did not have that reputation, and in fact had something of a reputation for racial hostility. But it was also an important center of military locations, and it is, of course, the southeastern, and the southernmost place in all of Iowa, right? So right there on the Mississippi River, right there near Missouri, and so got a lot of migrants for that reason. This was, and I believe still is, the Black church that was founded in Mount Pleasant during the war. It's a picture that I took when I was there a few years ago. And this is a little drawing of what Keokuk looked like during the time that it became more than 10% Black. And Keokuk also established its own Black church. Davenport also gained a large Black population, partly because of the military, but also because Davenport had a large German American population with its own reputation for being racially liberal. And so here we'll turn our attention to one specific Black wartime migrant. This is a photograph of Milton Howard and his family taken many years later, because during the war, Milton Howard is a teenager. He had actually been born free in Muscatine before the war. Then he was kidnapped and sold into slavery all the way down in Alabama as a small child. But as a teenager during the war, he fled from slavery and came back to Iowa. But this time, instead of going back to Muscatine, he settled in Davenport, where he lived with a German family. And they taught him actually the German language, and he had learned French while he was enslaved in Alabama. So he may have been the only trilingual Black Iowan, perhaps one of the only trilingual Iowans of any racial background. So Davenport becomes home to folks like Milton Howard. Moving to the southwest, Clarinda also became more than 10% Black, mainly because this was a heavy farming area and there was a huge need for farm laborers. And being so close to Missouri, hundreds of Black Missourians crossed the state line from northwest Missouri and settled in the broader Nottoway Valley and in Clarinda in particular. And so many of them were from the same place in northwest Missouri that in southwest Iowa, they were able to reestablish their ties of kinship and friendship. Although, ironically, the most prominent Black citizen in Clarinda was not one of these native Missourians. There's Clarinda's AME Church, and this is Thomas Gordon Jones, who had been born a slave in Georgia, had headed north during the war, was captured by Confederate troops in Tennessee, and then was freed by Union troops, and he came to Clarinda to work on the farm of a white officer. In Clarinda, he eventually bought his own farm and made a living also working as a masseuse and a chiropodist. And this photograph also taken many years after the war. Looking elsewhere in the state, in south central Iowa, Albia, Ottumwa, and Oskaloosa became home to hundreds of Black residents. Not quite as many went to sort of the eastern part of Iowa that's not quite on Mississippi River, but not too far from it. But there are also dozens of folks who went to Iowa City, Tipton, Cedar Rapids. Cedar Rapids, of course, has a much larger Black population today, but didn't back then. Mount Vernon and the town of Washington. To focus on a few of these migrants, the military sent 100 former slaves from Missouri to Tama County. And as it turns out, sorry, I have a few more pictures to show you all here. Tipton's Black Church, Iowa City's AME Church, where I went to worship when I was a student at the University of Iowa, go Hawks. And then in Tama County, the military sent about 100 former slaves from Missouri to settle there. One of them turned out to be somewhat famous. It's a young boy at the time named John Lewis Waller, and he later became an attorney, moved to Kansas, and became a prominent politician in Kansas' Black community, and then eventually was U.S. consul to Madagascar. But before all that, he was a wartime migrant to Tama County, Iowa. On the other hand, the town of Washington became home to a young man named Samuel Hall, who came to Iowa with a white officer and bought farmland eventually, and in 1912 published his slave narrative, his autobiography called 47 Years a Slave, where he describes his journey from slavery for many decades to freedom during the war to living the rest of his life in Iowa. As you can see from the bottom there, he's quite old by the time this is published. And I'll give you just one excerpt from this. He talks about how he had a particularly brutal master until finally he told his master that he wasn't having it anymore and said, quote, "You can sell me to the devil or any other place, but you can't whip me." So it's this sort of mentality that enabled him to take the step of coming to Iowa when he was already at that point, what you might call middle age, maybe even elderly. On the other hand, there were other parts of the state, like I mentioned before, where Black migrants lived in real isolation as the only family or the only individual. And those numbers pale in comparison to Clarinda, to Keokuk, to even to, say, Tipton or Iowa City. But each of these individuals or families became part of the local history in their new home. To give you a few excerpts, a Nashville native named John Sweat went to Alamaki County in far northeast Iowa and bought a farm and married a white woman. And apparently, this was not particularly controversial to his neighbors because they accepted him and his family. In another part of the state, in the small town of Gilman, a man named Peter Rice settled there, and he was apparently an expert in appraising livestock, and his neighbors respected him for that. But they also, their term for him, they didn't call him Peter Gilman, they didn't call him Mr. Gilman, they called him N-word Pete, except they didn't use N-word, they used the actual word. That's what they called him. And then a Black woman moved to Gilman, and now the Black population went from 1 to 2, and they decided to get married because, quote, they were lonely. Why are there 5 different places showing up here? Let me tell you the story of George Boykin. He was born in North Carolina before the war. During the war, he helped Union troops in North Carolina, and one of them, when he traveled to Rock Island, took young George Boykin with him. He's still a child at this point. A white couple from Waterloo took in this child, and then they later moved to a farm in Wright County. And they treated him well, but when he came of age, he decided not to take their last name, but he also did not want to keep the name Boykin, which was the name of his slave owner. He took the last name of his father, who had been sold apart from him many years earlier, and so George Boykin became George Reed Warren. As an adult, he traveled to Waterloo, where he met a young woman named Sarah James Suter, who had grown up in the town of McGregor. And they decided to get married, and they bought their own farm in Wright County, where they were the only Black family. Later on, they moved to Marshalltown in central Iowa because Sarah's sister already lived there. And George worked at a packing house, and they also bought farmland there. So uh, this is a traveling family, right? They've been, from the South to many different parts of the state. But everywhere that they go, they're one of the only Black families, if not the only Black family. So when you look at all these different stories, Peter Rice, John Swett, the Warrens, each of them dealt with racial isolation and the lack of kinship ties in their own way. In some cases, they created new kinship ties. In other cases, they created old kinship ties. In some cases, these kinship ties were made across racial lines. In some cases, they defined kinship as every other Black person in this area is my family. And in other cases, the kinship ties were only symbolic. Now, it's worth noting again that all of these migrants are coming to Iowa in violation of the state's anti-migration law. Now, again, this law had pretty much never been enforced, but now the war is on, and there's some folks in Iowa who are against the war, who are against the Republican administration, who are worried, who are against abolition, who are worried that the former slaves are going to be freed and come to Iowa and take over the state and take their jobs. And so basically, racist tension amplifies during the war to the point that some lawmakers actually called for a constitutional amendment to permanently ban Blacks from coming to the state. They said a law's not good enough. We need it to be in the Constitution. And this came to a head in 1862 when a former slave from Arkansas and a farm worker in rural Polk County named Archer Webb was arrested for violating the anti-migration law. One of the first people ever in 25 years to actually be arrested for violating this law. But his employer hired an attorney. And the judge in the case ruled that this law, which dated back to 1838, was unconstitutional and had always been unconstitutional because it violated the guarantee of freedom against unreasonable search and seizure. It violated the right to a trial by jury, and it violated the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, as of 1862, this law has been struck down by this judge in Polk County. And this is the first major legal change in some massive changes that are going to happen over the next few years. But now let's take a look at another important way that Black Iowa's history was transformed and transformed Iowa history by the law. Let's talk about the more than 1,000 Black men who served in Iowa's Black Civil War Regiment. It's possible that even before Iowa's Black Regiment was formed, there was one Black Iowan who enlisted. It's a man named Thomas Jeffries, who I've not been able to find an image of, but he may possibly have passed for white and joined the 15th Iowa Infantry in the early months of the war. And the story about this says that some of his fellow soldiers knew that he was of partial African ancestry, but they accepted him anyway. And he died in the early stages of the war, and they remembered him positively afterwards. But most Black Iowans, of course, could not do the same. In 1862, Alexander Clark sent a letter to Governor Sam Kirkwood offering to raise companies of Black troops to serve in an otherwise white regiment. Kirkwood did not respond, but his secretary did and wrote, "You know better than I the prejudices of our people, for you have felt them more severely, and you know your color would not be tolerated in one of our regiments. However wrong this may be, we cannot ignore the fact. No, thank you. We will keep our contributions to the war effort all white." As the war went on, though, especially in 1862 and 63, many white Iowans became increasingly supportive of the idea of Black enlistment. Let me give you a quote from a soldier named John Matthews, who was in the 13th Iowa Infantry. We have a lot of entries from his diary, and early in the war, as he's in the South, he's writing very racist and disparaging things about the Southern Black folk who he's coming into contact with. But by 1863, he has fought alongside Black troops from other states. And he writes, "The colored troops of this command have made a glorious name for themselves, as they have proven themselves as brave as the bravest, perfectly at home in the drill, and far ahead of everything else in military appearance and discipline. They have been complimented again and again by orders that praise in the mouth of everyone. You may think me an enthusiastic, but when you pass through what I have seen with them, what I have with them, and seen what I've seen, you will better understand my feelings toward that unfortunate race and the secret of that which seems to draw near to them the minute they come into contact with them. There is a better day coming for these poor people. There were also some white Iowans who took a more pragmatic approach, saying that if Black Iowans can enlist, that will help fill the state's enlistment quota. And also, that will save white lives. So let me give you two quotes from Governor Kirkwood. On one occasion, he said, which is the more decent man, the white man who, when called upon, deserts and skulks away, or the Negro who comes up bravely and fights? The man who fights, the man who does what he can to help crush the enemies of the country, is the man with whom I would clasp hands with always. So this seems like a very moral position to take. On another occasion, though, Governor Kirkwood simply said, when this war is over and we have summed up the entire loss of life it has imposed on the country, I shall not have any regrets if it is found that a part of the dead are in words and that all are not white men. For all these reasons, some more problematic than others, in May 1863, Governor Kirkwood gave permission to recruit for a new regiment that will be called the first Iowa Infantry African Descent, but was later renamed the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry, and that is the 60th battle flag, which is at the state capitol in Des Moines. The recruiting effort was assisted by Black civilians like Alexander Clark and a Washington barber named George Black, although Clark was unable to actually join the regiment because of an old leg injury. The recruitment also took place heavily in Missouri, right? And there's also some evidence, in fact, that some Black Missourians were impressed into joining the military, into joining the 60th, that they were essentially forced to join. For all these reasons, by late 1863, the 60th had its full roster of 10 companies of 100 men each for about 1,000 total. 4 of them were organized in Missouri, and the other 6 were organized in Iowa. But almost all of the people in the 60th who claimed Iowa as their home were, in fact, recent migrants to Iowa. And almost all of them lived in southeast Iowa or the Mississippi River alone. 1/10 of this regiment came from Keokuk alone. One of the men from Davenport who enlisted was Milton Howard. There were also a disproportionate number who came from the town of Newton, and we know a little more about their story. For instance, 3 siblings named Jason, John, and Taylor Green, along with their friends Lewis Mays and Alexander Fine, went from Kentucky to Missouri during the war, and then went to Newton, where they worked for white families and attended school until 1863, when they and 2 of their other friends enlisted. Also around the same time, 4 enslaved men from Missouri named Anderson Hayes, Henderson Hayes, John Graves, and Alex Nichols learned that their masters were planning to sell them from Missouri down in Texas. So they, in their words, borrowed horses and headed north to Iowa. They were captured by pro-slavery men in the town of Winifred while their horses were being shoed, but sympathetic townspeople helped them escape and then sent them to Newton, where they also worked until they enlisted. On the other hand, despite the fact that there was a large Black population in Clarinda and the broader Nottoway Valley, very few people from that area enlisted, and no one from the Black settlement up in Fayette County enlisted. As with all Black regiments, all of the commissioned officers in the 60th were white, led by Colonel John G. Hudson. The lower ranked and non-commissioned Black officers were community leaders like recruiter and now Sergeant George Black. Before the 60th left Iowa, they were presented with their regimental banner, which had been sewn for them by Black women in Muscatine and Keokuk. I'll pull that back up again, and was presented to them by Alexander Clark and the wife of one of the sergeants. And this is just one example of how Black civilians supported the war. Some families joined the soldiers in the military camps, but others remained at home where wives had to keep the family together and support the family while the husbands were away and deal with, job insecurity, deal with the threat of violence. There were some children who had to drop out of school to make up for the loss of income now that their fathers were in the military because they were being paid less as soldiers than they would have as laborers. Also, black barbers in Muscatine and Keokuk opened barbershops to help shave the troops. And one black preacher in Keokuk gave a prayer that called for, quote, the utter extinguishment of all rebels. The 60th trained at Benton Barracks outside St. Louis, and 22 of them died in just 1 month, mainly because the living conditions were so horrible. The local officials refused to provide them even with hospital beds or blankets. After a month in Benton Barracks, they transferred to Helena, Arkansas, which the soldiers had nicknamed Hell in Arkansas because the living conditions were so poor, especially for black troops. And so by the time the war was over, of the 1,000 men who served in the 60th, more than 300 of them died, almost all from disease, because the conditions in Arkansas were so poor. While in Arkansas, the 60th mainly performed guard duty and manual labor, including doing dock work similar to what many of them had done when they were living in Mississippi River towns in Iowa. They also went on scouting missions in the countryside, where they took dozens of prisoners without suffering any casualties. And they took part in two instances of combat. Most notably, this is what Helena looked like during the war, the Battle of Wallace's Ferry in 1864. Not nearly as famous as Gettysburg or Antietam, but I'll briefly share with you the story. So while they were out scouting, sorry, the PowerPoint's moving ahead without my permission. While they were out scouting one day, they were, caught by surprise. They were, a sneak attack was carried out by Confederate troops, which was part of a broader plan to drive the federal troops out of Arkansas and then set the stage for an invasion of Missouri. So this attack at Wallace's Ferry is part of a broader plan to try to take back Arkansas and Missouri. But the 60th and members of other regiments were able to repel this attack, despite the fact that they were outnumbered 5-1. And then they successfully retreated back to the fort at Helena. They suffered 44 casualties, including 3 black troops who were actually injured, and while they were lying injured on the battlefield, were murdered by Confederates. This was actually Confederate policy. We will not take black troops prisoner. We will kill them on the spot or sell them into slavery. When the battle was over, the officer reports praised the conduct of the 60th and the other troops who were at Wallace's Ferry. One officer said, quote, except for this reconnaissance, I would have had my hands full tomorrow. 80 of the 60th has won great credit. Another officer said, we rejoice in the glory acquired on this well-disputed field by our colored troops. Will they fight? Asked the enemy. After Wallace's Ferry, they returned to mainly doing guard duty and labor duty and scouting. There was one other successful skirmish with Confederate troops. Some of them also attended a regimental school where they learned to read and write. Until finally, when the war ended in April 1865, now the 60th was part of an army of occupation in Arkansas until October 1865, when they were mustered out and sent home by way of Davenport. And it was there in Davenport that they played an even greater role in shaping Iowa's post-war history. Now, I noted before that voting rights were limited to white men, and the voters had rejected overwhelmingly an amendment to the new Constitution in 1857 that would have given Black men the right to vote. So, to explain the legal process here, in order to amend the Constitution, you would have needed to have 2 consecutive meetings of the state legislature, pass a resolution in favor of an amendment, and then a referendum would go out to the voters and they'd have to approve it. So it's kind of a long and complicated process. But now there's greater effort to try to get Black voting rights in Iowa and all over the country, right? So African Americans argued that they had earned the right to vote by their loyalty to the country during the war and by their military service. And they contrasted that with the disloyalty of white Confederates and of white Northerners who sympathized with the Confederacy. Now, this happened all over the country, but it was especially important in Iowa. Iowa was a young state in 1860. Iowa had played no part in the War of Independence or the War of 1812 or the Mexican-American War. So the Civil War, in many ways, comes to define Iowa, and Iowa defines itself by its Civil War record. So basically, in that sort of climate, Black Iowans see an opportunity to say, if you're going to make a big deal about what people did during the war, take a look at what we did during the war. Consider, for instance, Iowa's second governor of the Civil War after Kirkwood, Governor William Stone, who said, and I apologize in advance for this language, said that he would rather sleep with an N-word than a copperhead. Copperhead being a term for a white Northerner who supported the South. There were also, in 1865, the Republican State Convention passed a platform that supported amending the state constitution to give Black men the right to vote. And this got the support of Governor Stone, of newspaper editors all over the state, of leading Republican politicians. It got widespread support. In response to that, the Democratic Party in 1865 renamed itself the Union Anti-Negro Suffrage Party. Their platform in 1865 was Black men should not get the right to vote. And they said, if Black men get the right to vote, then they'll all move to Iowa, they'll take our jobs, they'll all marry white women, and they'll commit horrible crimes against white women and against our property. So we have to oppose Black suffrage, or Iowa will turn into a hellscape. Didn't work. The Republicans easily won the 1865 statewide conventions. Or, I'm sorry, it's 1865 statewide elections. Shortly after that, the 700 surviving members of the 60th held a convention of colored Iowa soldiers in Davenport, where they were led by their non-commissioned officers and by Alexander Clark. They wrote a list of resolutions, a public address, and a petition that they were going to present to the state legislature. They also sent all these documents to newspapers all over the state and to the AME Christian Recorder, which was the leading Black newspaper in the country. Here's part of what the list of resolutions from this convention said. We, feeling conscious that we have discharged our duty as soldiers in the defense of our country, respectfully urge that it is the duty of Iowa to allow us the use of our votes at the polls, believing as we do and must that he who is worthy to be trusted with the musket can and ought to be trusted with the ballot. Also at this soldiers' convention, Alexander Clark gave an address in which he said, fellow countrymen, which he's speaking to white Iowans, and then says, we wish we could truthfully address you as fellow citizens. And then went on to say that the laws that denied Black men the right to vote violated the Constitution, the federal Constitution, violated the spirit of the American War of Independence, violated and went against the efforts that African Americans had undertaken to earn equal rights. Shortly after this convention, the governor of Iowa himself, in his inaugural address, cited this convention and repeated many of the claims that the Black veterans had made in saying we should give Black men the right to vote. In 1866, the first necessary resolution passed. So the first step of 3 has happened. Before the next step could happen, Frederick Douglass himself came to Davenport and gave a speech in which he said, the elective franchise should be extended to the Negro because he is a man, because he has earned it. You all may have picked up by now that there's some very, very gendered language going on here. Unfortunately, this is marginalizing Black women and really women of every background, because if you equate military service with citizenship, but you also deny women the right to serve in the military, then you are also indirectly denying women the right to citizenship, right? But this is also in a climate when Black men are not thought of or treated as men at all by many white Americans. In early 1868, before the state legislature met again, Black leaders from all over the state held an Iowa State Color Convention. The announcement for this convention said, that we are, quote, considering the question of our enfranchisement, which is now before the legislature and will soon be submitted to the voters of Iowa for their votes. All in favor of equal rights come. Strike for freedom while it is day. At this convention, Alexander Clark spoke again on the question of Black suffrage. And this is a little bit of a longer quote. So, in the interest of time, I think I will just paraphrase some of this. We simply ask that the two streams of loyal blood which it took to conquer one, mad with treason, shall not be separated at the ballot box. We demand this as native-born citizens of the United States, who have never known other allegiance than to its authority and laws of our state, and as those who have been true and loyal to our government from its foundation to the present time, and who have never deserted its interest, whilst even in the midst of treason. We ask in the name of the honored name of 200,000 colored troops, 500 of whom from our own Iowa, who enlisted under the flag of our country and the banner of our state. So again, we have earned the right to vote by our blood, by our military service. Later that year, the state legislature passed the second necessary resolution. And so that means in the statewide elections that fall, there would also be a referendum on whether or not the Constitution should be amended. Now, remember, this referendum had failed by 83% in 1857. In 1868, it passes 57% to 43%. So a narrow margin to be sure, but it passed. And I'll give you just one specific breakdown of these numbers. In 1857, the vote in Poweshiek County against Black male suffrage had been 56 to 601. In 1868, the citizens of Poweshiek County approved Black male suffrage 653 to 221. This meant that Iowa was now the sixth state in the entire country, or in the North, I should say, where Black men had the right to vote. It was also the first state outside the Northeast where Black men got the right to vote. The other five northern states were all up in New England. And so Iowa becomes the first state outside of that region where Black men get the right to vote. And it's also worth noting that several other states in the Midwest and the West rejected Black suffrage by various means over the next few years until the 15th Amendment in 1870 said that you have to recognize it all over the state. So let's talk about, why is Iowa different? Why did Iowans vote in favor of Black male suffrage when other parts of the country had rejected? It wasn't because Iowa had a Black male regiment. It's not simply that, because other Midwestern states also had Black Civil War regiments. Illinois had one. Who's from Wisconsin fought in Illinois. Kansas had one. So, Iowa is not the only state to do that. So there's a couple of reasons why Iowa is different. One reason is the support from important political leaders, like those newspaper editors, like the two Civil War governors who lent their support to this. Also, the fact that there was such widespread support in one of Iowa's biggest cities, in the town of Davenport, and also widespread support in Muscatine and Mount Pleasant, which were not as big as Davenport, but were still very important politically. There's also, again, the central role of the Civil War itself in Iowa's self-identity. And then finally, and most of all, there's what Black Iowans themselves did to press the issue. There's the way that they were able to use the rhetoric of wartime loyalty to influence politicians and their voters, especially at the 1865 Soldiers Convention, but also at the 1868 Convention, through Frederick Douglass's visit, through all the things that they did to put this issue out there before the white voters and to try to change their mind, right? Now, again, other states had their own Black regiments. Other states had their own Black leaders who said similar things. So why is Iowa different? I would argue that Iowa's different because its Black population was large enough to successfully press for change. There's enough of them in numbers that they could say, here's what we did, and that they can, engage with the political process. But they're also few enough in numbers that white supporters of Black suffrage felt, we can do this because we'll still be in charge even if Black men get the right to vote. There's some white politicians who look around and say, you Democrats who are saying that the blacks are going to take over the state if we give them the right to vote. We're the vast majority of the state. We will still be in charge. So it's sort of a pragmatic and also kind of, in my opinion, distasteful view of progress, right? We can give these people what they want because we'll still be in charge when it's over. But that's not going to happen in a place like, say, Illinois or Ohio, where, white politicians might say, you know what, they actually will be in charge of certain things if they get the right to vote because there are so many of them, right? So this is my argument in terms of, my grad school advisor used to call this the Goldilocks argument. Like I was not too big, not too little. It's just right in terms of black population. But this is the argument that I make in terms of why this effort was successful. I think I'm just about out of time here. There's a few other things that I want to share with you in terms of what the Black veterans did after the war. And so if there are questions about that, then I could certainly go into that some more. Talk about the Black veterans organizations that were formed after the war. Talk about the efforts by the Black veterans to try to get their military pensions because there's some fascinating stories there as well. And then talking about the way that Emancipation Day and the Iowa State Bystander newspaper were used to remember slavery and the war and the progress that was made after the war, right? So just putting those things out there in terms of some of the other things that I was going to talk about. I apologize, I didn't do a good enough job of thinking about how much time I had for each thing. But if you all would like to hear more about that in this Q&A session, I would be glad to go into that some more. And also, if you have questions about what I've already talked about, then that's fine. Whatever questions you have, I'm glad to take those now. But thank you for listening and for going through this journey with me. And now I will turn it over to the facilitators so that they can run the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Brodnax. We do have about 6 minutes to answer some questions. So as a reminder, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom. Just note that we may not be able to get to all the questions today. So first question we had, Dr. Brodnax, was, have you ever worked or discussed any of your research with the African American Museum of Iowa based in Cedar Rapids?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I have. I actually, back when I was still in grad school and that museum was just starting, I was one of the advisors for it. And I've done some lectures there over the years. I have partnered with them on certain things. And they're a great museum. When I lived in Iowa back in the 90s, the museum didn't actually exist yet, but there was talk about starting it. So I was very happy in the early 2000s, only a few years later when it started. And I was very glad to play my own small part in helping to get the museum going and working with them on different things. And I'm happy to continue to do so in the future. So the quick answer to your question is yes, I have worked with them and shared some of my research with them.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer. We would love to talk about the Black Civil War veteran groups. I know we probably won't get into as much detail as we could, but what was their presence like in Iowa?
Well, in terms of the veterans groups after the war?
Yes.
Sure. So there's a national organization called the Grand Army of the Republic, or the GAR for short. And historians who refer to this as America's first lobbying group. It was sort of it was one of the largest voluntary organizations in the entire country by the late 1800s because membership was open to anyone who had served in the Union Army or Navy, or the Union military during the war, Army, Marines, Navy during the war, and had been honorably discharged, right? And so there's GAR posts all over the country. There's two Black GAR posts in Iowa. There's one in Keokuk, and I think the other one was in Des Moines. But what's interesting is that there are Black Iowans who integrated white GAR posts in other places, right? So, for instance, there's a post in Newton, and all the Black veterans who went there were active in that. There's a post in Dallas County that had one Black member, and so integrated in that own sort of way, right? So they're involved in this now. There's other states where Black veterans could not join white GAR posts, like they had to either be in a Black post or not be an organization at all. But in Iowa, there's two Black posts. There's one integrated post, but then also there's sort of informal veterans activities. So the fact that there were so many veterans in Newton, um, and I want to give a shout out to my friend Dwayne Coleman, who's done a lot of research on them. But because there's so many of them, they sort of form an unofficial veterans group in their town. And then in 1894, there's a sort of a big gathering of veterans in Des Moines where they're going to take all the battle flags from all the different regiments and put them on display in the state capitol. And they call on all the veterans who at this point are, middle aged to come take part in the parade, take part in the festivities. And so Iowa's Black newspaper, The Bystander, calls on the veterans of the 60th to come and take part. And a few dozen of them actually did. And they marched and they had their own separate meeting where they decided they would form their own, basically, veterans organization of people who had served in the 60th. Now, I haven't been able to find evidence of what they actually did after that initial meeting. They were kind of scattered all over the state. And so I'm not sure what they might have actually done, but they did at least have that initial veterans meeting in 1894, almost 30 years after they had been discharged. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, of course. And we do have time. We'll do one more question here before we wrap up. So you have done a lot of research on this topic. Are there some favorite sources around this topic that may interest other people or that you found really interesting? And just kind of any like recommendations that people who would want to dig a little further into this topic?
Sure. There's probably the most famous book on Black Iowa history is Outside In, which was published about 20 or so years ago. And this is, and I say this with no disparaging, with no disparagement meant. This is definitely more of like a coffee table book. It's sort of looking at different segments of Black Iowa history and sort of telling interesting stories. It's got lots of great stories. It's got lots of great pictures. If you want a more scholarly look in terms of this history, I will mention three of my fellow historians. The person who wrote the first major book on this history is Robert Dykstra. So his book, Bright Radical Star, it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. I would definitely mention that. Leslie Schwam, who teaches at the University of Iowa, has done research on this, and her book is called Emancipation's Diaspora, and looks at Iowa and Minnesota. So there's some really great stuff there. And then I mentioned a second ago, Dwayne Coleman, who actually just finished his PhD, and he's got some journal articles that are out. I don't think his book is quite out, but he's definitely published some different journal articles looking at different veterans organizations. I'll also mention looking at it from more of a digital history perspective. There's a great website that's called Black Conventions. I'm forgetting the exact name, but I'm sure if you Google like Black Conventions 1800s, you'll find it. And it's basically a group of different historians who have collected the primary sources from all the hundreds of different Black conventions to place over around the country, right? So it includes, for instance, the two that I mentioned today. It also includes some other ones in Iowa that I talked about. So you can go into those, and instead of just having like the little brief excerpts that I gave you from the list of resolutions, from Alexander Clark's address, you can look at all the things that they wrote, right? And you can also learn more about what Black community leaders were doing, at other times, doing in other states. So that's a phenomenal website to look at. Yeah, there's definitely, that when it comes to Black Midwestern history, disproportionately speaking, when I started grad school, it was mainly focused on since the Great Migration. There was a sense of there just really wasn't a lot of Black Midwestern history to even study and write about. Until you get to the 1910s and Black folks started moving up to Chicago and Cincinnati and Waterloo and places like that, right? But what we've seen, and I'm glad to have been a part of that, is there's a whole lot there, right? To look at in states like Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana, and so forth, Wisconsin. And there's been a lot more written about that. And some of the scholars who I mentioned are part of that. That website is part of that. And then if you look at those books and you look in the back and look at sources that they cite, that you can find more great things. There's so many great things out there to read to learn more about 19th century Black Iowa history and 19th century Black Midwestern history.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we would like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Dr. Brodnax. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. Looking to learn more Iowa history? You can find and watch over 50 recorded webinars of past 101 programs on the Iowa Culture YouTube channel. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on May 23rd. The topic will be Iowa's Latinas and Latinos, Forging Latinidad from Field to Campus. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great afternoon.